So we have just a very short while to go before we begin this webinar. We've started broadcasting. We've now got the participant count rapidly rising. So we'll just wait for half a minute until we until it's clear that we've got everybody. We have about 150 registered, which is great. So well, we've just about edged our way into the afternoon in the UK. So good afternoon. It's different times for different participants here. So good morning, good wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. This is, I think, 6 in a series of webinars hosted by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics on questions related to COVID-19. The Nuffield Council, as I'm sure most people will know, is an independent body that looks at ethical issues arising from developments in biological and medical research. We published around many questions, but obviously there are many in relation to COVID that interest us as well as others. We've got a discussion today around antibody testing and certification. But of course, this is a question that goes much wider than simply antibody testing and the potential for state interest in immunity certification, as it also reaches into questions of other ways in which individual risk might be identified, and ways in which either individuals or the state or private or commercial interests might have some interest in identifying those people who are at larger or lesser risk from coronavirus and COVID-19. And this has many implications for individual concerns, privacy interests, but other opportunities. For example, if there were an interest in identifying those who should be included or excluded from certain types of activities, whether employment or other things. That's all I will say. We have 3 speakers, Bobbie, Farsides, Ganguli-Mitra and Steffen Augsberg. I will ask them to speak in a moment. I won't give them lengthy introductions. They are all pretty well known to many people, but you can see the details on our website and the introduction to this seminar. We have left the Q&A function on, so that anybody who wishes to put a question to the panelists, as we'll come back to some discussion at the end, please put that in the Q&A. It's not really manageable to carry out a chat function or to bring those attending into the discussion. So please look to the Q&A, and we will try to pick up key questions, as many of those as we can, when we come on to the discussion at the end. So that's it from me. I am going to leave it now with our panelists, and I will invite Bobbie Farsides, first of all, to lead us in, broadly speaking, to help us to identify issues that are associated with immunity testing and possibly for certification. But Bobbie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Hugh. Unusually, to keep to time, I've written quite thorough notes for this talk, so please excuse me if I'm looking down from time to time. So, as nice as it is to be here with everybody, if things had gone to plan, I would have been in Malawi today. And no doubt many of you would have been in different places doing different things and applying your time to different issues. So much has changed. Yet at a crucially important level, nothing has changed. A novel virus has entered a world the features of which in many ways are fixed, and this cannot fail to affect its impact. However much we speak of a new normal post-COVID, it's difficult to see the potential for transformation at a fundamental level. I therefore want to argue that it is that which has not changed in our society which makes the idea of immunity certification so worrying. Back in early January of this year, few people had heard of a virus which by July 2020 has resulted in over 512,000 deaths worldwide. Despite the best efforts of the world's scientists, there's still much that we do not understand. And even the most optimistic predictions place a vaccination and/or effective new treatments somewhere in a less than immediate future. Across the world, countries have gone into varying degrees of lockdown, with unavoidable impacts on commerce, employment, education, mental health, etc. It's clearly a very difficult political challenge to manage communities out of a state which prioritised protection and disease prevention and back into a world where everyday activities carry a level of risk previously uncountenanced. It is in the interest of managing this shift that the idea of immunity certification is often discussed. As such, the clear focus is on giving those who have acquired immunity ways to re-enter the marketplace, the workplace, leisure facilities, and other destinations of choice, be that as employees, service providers, vendors, or consumers. Whilst we must acknowledge our scientific limitations in relation to understanding the virus and our ability to test for it, this feels like a moment in which to employ the philosopher's prerogative to go beyond what is practically possible in present in order to understand and ask whether it should ever be considered that immunity testing and certification, as to quote a recent commentator, be used as a get out of jail card, free card. As I said at the outset, my response to this question rests on my thoughts about the world we live in, and specifically what remains the same in this world, which seems so altered at first glance. Frankly, we still live in a world characterised by inequality between and within nations. We operate in a global political environment where supranational bodies such as the WHO have to transcend decisions and insurmountable differences based on power, wealth, and ideology, where major powers feel able to dissociate themselves from the collaborative approach exemplified by such institutions. We live in a world which is finally waking up to and acknowledging injustices that brought thousands of responsible people out of the safety of their homes to protest that Black Lives Matter. The disproportionate loss of life within BME communities in the UK means that COVID has shone a light on existing social and health inequalities. And when thinking about certification, we cannot ignore the fact that our recent history is blighted by the discriminatory practices embedded in stop and search strategies. Nor can we deny that the statistics regarding those who have been fined for breaking lockdown appear to reflect similar patterns of targeting members of particular communities and ethnic groups. It is against this background that we would be introducing a new and potentially stigmatizing division into our society. While some have argued that BME communities have a lot to gain, both in terms of being protected by and being liberated from constraints, we really need to know whether members of communities made more vulnerable by the virus believe that an immunity certification system would be designed to serve their interests and operated in a way that protected their rights. We need to work with the people of Birmingham, Leicester, Bradford and Brent before we assume anything or do anything. In testing the ethical feasibility of any proposal, it's wise to ask how it will impact upon the most vulnerable in our society. Some of the most heartrending stories of the lockdown period came from homeless people who were given temporary housing to remove them from the streets. How, if at all, will these people be served by a certification programme? What about the refugee or the asylum seeker? Will they be able to make themselves sufficiently visible to be part of whatever this scheme has to offer? What about the disabled person whose assiduous adherence to shielding has protected them from the virus, but now discounts them from a certificate, which is the key to doors they might already find difficult to open? There are, of course, those of us who have continued to enjoy our privilege throughout the lockdown period. Have we got good reason to feel that the system will work for us? If that is, we can put aside our concern for others. We have watched how the political responses unfolded, and despite the government's mantra of following the science, we have learnt that facts and interpretations of facts are disputed, statistics are carefully managed, political advisors are present in scientific meetings, and night after night we watched as highly respected scientific and medical figures became the adjuncts of ministers in carefully managed daily briefings, only to disappear if they went off script. We have learnt that political decisions have not always followed the science, and that they famously do not appear to apply equally to all. We have observed decisions which clearly supported the agenda of outsourcing, privatisation and fragmentation of the NHS, whilst failing to best serve patients or carers. We've seen a form of scientific and technological nationalism divert attention from more established ways of doing things, as in the case of the ill-fated app. We've noted an increasingly urgent emphasis upon opening up and protecting the economy, and seen how this has come to compete directly with the philosophy of lockdown, which rested upon a sense of solidarity and a shared commitment to protecting the NHS and, quote, beating the virus. It is against this background that we must ask whether the immunity passport is the correct means to an end we feel it's safe for our government to prioritise and pursue. So before we start debating the finer points of immunology, the feasibility of different testing regimes, the issues around false positives and false negatives, questions of who will issue your certificate and where it will and will not count, the merits and demerits of deliberate infection in the interests of acquiring immunity, whether systems will be supported by legislation, and if and how and by whom digressions will be detected and punished, the problem of counterfeit documents and fraudulent test results, the question of who pays for what and who runs the system, etc., etc., etc. We, the privileged, need to recognise how the structural characteristics of our society and the political priorities of our government will dictate in large part how such a proposal would play out in reality. We need to understand that the dominant structure in this instance is the market, which famously and unashamedly benefits the few, often at the cost of the many. Whilst this may be particularly true with regard to the vulnerable and the previously disadvantaged, we who enjoy privilege would also be vulnerable to the impact of a system which characterised people in terms of their relationship to a virus and treated them accordingly. The potential for precarity in our lives is increasingly apparent. We are told that the economic realities of the coming years will be harsh, and the fact that you and those with whom you compete or collaborate have or have not got a certificate could play out in a variety of ways which prove that it is far from the golden ticket you were sold. So whether it's from a position of moral concern for others or of self-interest, this is an issue on which we really do need to remain alert.
Thanks very much, Bobbie. And it's quite interesting, I think, to reflect on it. As you say, that this is, you know, the dominant structure is the marketplace. And one's just reminded of the fact that, you know, immunity certification isn't something that is necessarily only in the hands of government, but government might either permit or encourage private arrangements or commercial arrangements that is not necessarily a single structure either. So I think there are all sorts of dimensions to that are not simply about should the government do this. Now, we'll go directly now to Ago Ganguli-Mitra at Edinburgh Law School. Ago, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. So what I would like to do is to really unpack and elaborate on some of the issues around inequality that Bobbie has so beautifully presented to us. And here's what I would like us to think about. So in thinking about the ethical issues raised by any form of immunity license or certification, here's what we have known so far in the pandemic. We know that in this pandemic, just as in any other global health emergencies, people are not affected equally. We also know that the effects of social distancing, of slowing down the economy, of the lockdown has not been equal for all. So Public Health England reports that people of Bangladeshi ethnicity have around twice the risk of death when compared to people of white British ethnicity. People of Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, other Asian, Caribbean, and other black ethnicity have between 10 to 50% higher increased risk of death when compared to their white British counterpart. The differential effects on people of color, marginalized, and racialized groups have been reported in other European countries as well as in North America. So unsurprisingly, there is strong evidence of an association between economic disadvantage and COVID diagnosis, of their incidence and the incidence of severe disease. Economic disadvantage is also associated with the prevalence of obesity, smoking, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, all of which link to the underlying comorbidities of COVID. The social determinants of health, of course, also include discrimination, stigma, and other systemic forms of racism. So as Bobbie said, how you fare in this pandemic strongly relates to your status and your privilege. And COVID has really laid bare the fragilities of our social and healthcare systems across the world, of course in the UK as well, especially when it comes to addressing questions of inequality. So going forward, thinking about the ethics of immunity certification, we'll have to incorporate a strong analysis of how social and health-based inequalities will be affected. So we might want to think about it in three ways. So first, how might the development and deployment of any form of immunity certification exacerbate existing inequalities and injustices? How might they end up creating new forms of inequalities and injustices? And finally, whether there's any way of implementing such schemes within our public health systems in ways that might mitigate those inequalities and injustices. And in doing so, we'll need to think carefully about the interests both of those who will be able to resume economic activity and movement and those who will be further confined. And we also need to think about how to include the voices of those who will be most affected. This kind of certification or license potentially presents a form of instant stratification of a population. And from an ethical perspective, this is particularly problematic because of the way in which this immunity is acquired. This is nothing like a vaccination certification. Here, the onus is not on the state to enable the conditions for immunity, but rather on the individual to attain immunity through infection. And that includes risk of death, risk of long-term and potentially debilitating effects. It also puts at disadvantage those who have made the recommended sacrifices, sometimes at great personal cost, to avoid being infected. And of course, this presents a particularly problematic incentive of getting infected in order to gain immunity. In the UK, as well as in other parts of the world, we have seen how difficult it has been to implement and access testing. And often such differences in access mirror inequalities in access to healthcare in general. These are further exacerbated by historical and ongoing distrust of healthcare systems by marginalized communities, where they have faced often systematic discrimination and racism, which is inbuilt in the very structure of our health institutions. We tend sometimes to think about this kind of certification as a way to restart the economy, but of course the economy hasn't really stopped. It has been propped up by millions of low-paid frontline workers whose immunity status we haven't really bothered with so far, or for that matter, the risk they have been forced to take. In big cities like London, a large percentage of key workers, that is supermarket workers, transport, and so on, these roles have been held disproportionately by Black and other minority ethnic groups. So we'll have to start thinking very carefully about the relationship between access to testing, incentives to be immune, and the potential implementation of such schemes by employers on workers whose voices and interests are routinely dismissed and sidelined. We need to think carefully about the relationship between such license or certification and immigration and residence status. So immigrants who live and work in the UK on a visa already face several huge obstacles and burdens, the NHS surcharge being one such example. So we want to think very carefully about allowing employers and other institutions to implement another potentially discriminatory barrier. We need to think about those who will have to make the choice to remain at home, perhaps because they live in multi-generational families or have to live in close quarters with others, because then being infected means putting others at risk, whom they're shielding. To this, you want to add the concern of the gendered care burden and how this will increase if one person, usually the man in the family, who might be the highest earner, or the one whose visa the family depends on, has to perhaps live away in order to continue working, or is forced to go back to work because they're considered to have acquired the immunity. We will need to consider those with chronic illnesses for whom this route to immunity is never going to be an option. So we talk about travel, but of course travel is not only for business and tourism. Immigrant families need to travel for many reasons, including care duties and taking care of multi-generational families across borders. This will become particularly difficult if the certification regimes and rules are not harmonized across borders, and if there is increased racial profiling at borders. Implementing such schemes will also come with some form of monitoring and surveillance, and potentially increase the scrutiny of specific groups, including racial, religious, or sexual minorities. And this is going to be a global problem. So finally, there have been sort of voices suggesting that immunity certification can be a way of mitigating such risks. So people who have been at risk of being infected will have acquired the immunity, and therefore will be better placed to then go back to work. But having presented what I've said so far, I'm very doubtful whether this is possible at all without taking existing inequalities seriously. And I think this is a particularly problematic line of thinking in terms of ethics, this relationship between good citizenship and employment, and their relationship with what we think is a free public health and health system. So I think these are some of the links that we're going to have to think about very carefully when it comes to the ethics of immunity certification. And finally, we think a lot about public engagement, but of course, again, the public is not a homogeneous group. So it is not just the public or the publics even that we want to think about, but really considering systematically the voices, the interests of those who stand to lose the most from immunity certification. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Ago. I think it demonstrates very clearly how many different important factors will play into this question. And whilst immunity certification seems very appealing at a rather simplistic policy level, it's also, and I think the last point that you made was about public engagement is important. It's also superficially very appealing to launch it into the public. Whereas there needs to be a real engagement and understanding much more widely about what those wider implications are. So many thanks. So I'm going to move now straight on to Steffen Augsberg, who is in Hamburg. You're very welcome, Steffen. Please occupy the space.
Thank you so much, Hugh, and thank you so much for inviting me. You might have heard the saying that while an American usually starts a presentation with a joke, the German speaker tends to start his presentation with an apology. And I'm trying to stay true to this cultural stereotype here. When I got the invitation by Pete, and I happily agreed to take part in this webinar, I was under the strong impression that by today we would have a finished recommendation of the German Ethics Council that I could just present to you, tell you about our thought process and what we intend to do with the recommendation in the future. As things turns out, we are far from finishing this recommendation. We had a plenary discussion last week, and at the end of which we found out that maybe we're even further apart than we thought would be possible before. So right now, the German Ethics Council, to put it short, is in limbo with regard to immunity certification. We have another meeting by the working group next week, and I'm going to take part in that. And hopefully we will be able to come up with a solution of sorts in the coming weeks. But as things stand, it looks as if there is no consensus reached in our council at the moment. And to put another disclaimer in front of my presentation, I am one of those dissenting with the majority on this. So, and I'm maybe if we have time, I'm going to say I'll give a short statement of what I personally think, but I'm not going to stress that here. I'm just trying to give you an insight into our way of dealing with the problem and basically the stumbling blocks that we have faced in the process. So we started off because we were asked by the German Health Secretary to think about ethical aspects regarding the implementation of a planned regulation that he had put into the public. And it was a rather unique and unprecedented scene that actually the German government would refrain from bringing forward a governmental legislative proposal. And while it was already being discussed in government, they decided they needed more time to think about it, especially they needed time for us to think about it. So they asked the German Ethics Council to come up with a sort of idea of how to deal with immunity certification, which basically also explains why we are so unhappy with the way things have gone in the past few weeks, because we are being tasked with something that we seem to be unable to do, or at least we seem to be unable to do that in due time. What we did, we established a working group that prepared a preliminary version of a possible recommendation. And in it, we focused on the normative aspects. We focused on risk ethics, and we also tried to lay the foundations of a fundamental rights-based approach, with the idea in mind that although we basically agree on all the possible risks that have been laid out by the distinguished speakers before me, there is also the aspect that we are talking about freedom that can be regained by issuing these immunity certifications. So it's of course, there are many problems associated with the idea of the institution, but it's also something that has to be kept in mind, that we're not talking about infringements of rights, but we're talking about giving people back freedoms that have been taken away from them during the crisis. And there is a prima facie argument to be made that has to be done under German constitutional law, at least. So we are under a certain amount of duress that we need to come up with a solution for this, just as we do in other aspects, just as we do everywhere else where we're trying to relieve the burden that's being put on people in the context of the fight against the coronavirus. So that's the approach we took. And then we tried to come up with an assessment of the chances and the risks associated with these kinds of certifications. And then we presented it to the plenary, and it turned out that people there were much more doubtful about the possibility of institutionalizing this version than the working group was, and especially with regard to the scientific background. So people were especially concerned that it wouldn't be possible at all to say with any degree of a sufficient degree of certainty that someone actually is immune. So while we try to focus on the normative aspects in the plenary discussions, it turned out people were much more careful about the lack of certainty with regard to the scientific background. And so it went back to the working group, and we formulated something that we thought would be suitable as a compromise. And in that we focused also on the way we could, well, put something forward that addresses both the uncertainty aspect, but also the need to help fighting the virus. And what we did was we presented for once the immunity certification, and we said that, well, this is something while testing is still unclear whether it works. This is something where the normative aspects are also unclear or more unclear. And so we're not sure, well, we can't recommend this as something that has to be implemented in the near future. That might be something in the mid or long term. And it's also something that should be implemented with regard to contact with vulnerable persons, and also with regard to people that are working in professions where they're come in close personal contact with others. So we're trying to focus the scope of the immunity certifications. And then we also added something completely new and maybe a bit out of the scope of the original question asked by the German Secretary of Health, where we said, well, there is also the possibility to document your antibody status. So something which might be called a partial immunity. And here we're not really sure how it works. And the process of the scientific discovery obviously is ongoing. There are new studies being published every day. But what we can say here with a sufficient certainty, at least the majority thought so, was that if we establish a partial immunity, that it also is only being added to existing safety measures. So, for example, that has to be added to PPE. It doesn't it supplements PPE. It doesn't. So you can't take off your protection because you rely on your immunity, as it were. But it also it just adds to the protection you already have. And we thought, the majority thought, that that would be something that is actually helpful, because it helps to keep people safe, especially in environments where there are vulnerable people and where there is a lack of contact maybe. And this also was attacked by a minority within the council. In fact, it is still not safe enough. The evidence we have from the scientific discovery doesn't suffice at the moment. So we are still thinking about whether we can implement that or whether we can recommend that or not. So we are right now, and I'm coming to the end, we're right now in the process of thinking about how we can actually go on with our discussions, how we can come up with a recommendation that maybe does consist of a new compromise, or whether we will be forced to come up with a version of our recommendation that includes at least one, maybe two dissenting opinions. And we are meeting again next week, and I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today. And I invite you all to provide me with feedback that I will happily take into the working group. And a last comment, just as a matter of honesty here. I am the one person in the council that is much less critical of the institution, of the instrument, than all the others. I'm a lawyer by trade. I do constitutional law for a living, and I think it is possible. So maybe I'm an optimist. I think it is possible to come up with a smart regulation that addresses all the issues that we talked about before, but that handles the instrument in a way that we can responsibly install it. And you might disagree with that, or Bobbie and Ego already did disagree with that, but I'm quite optimistic here. Maybe it's also because I think more highly of our healthcare system. Maybe we are better equipped. Hopefully we are better equipped. Maybe I'm overestimating our healthcare system as well as our political system, but I do think there is a possibility to come up with a mechanism that might keep this instrument in check. So just for example, because Ego pointed towards monitoring and surveillance, and I see your point with regard to minorities. I would use a completely different approach and say I'm in favor of monitoring and surveillance, but not of minorities, but of the legislative process and of the implementation. So we have to keep checking whether the instrument works. We have to keep checking whether there are undue influences, whether the people are being more or less forced to take part in this. So all your aspects that you addressed. And I think that's something that's especially important with regard to situations where we necessarily can't know just half of what we would like to know, but we are under a degree of uncertainty that makes going forward so hard. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Steffen. And I'm just going to move you into a panel view so that everybody has a kind of equal status as we have a number of questions here, and rather than read them out directly, I think I just want to read into them a little bit. And I think there's a few areas I'd just like to explore a little bit. One is about, just from a kind of conceptual point of view, how significant is it that we might move from an approach that involves locking down the majority, as it were, to a situation where we are protecting a minority. Now, that minority may be of one sort or another. I mean, is this conceptually, and from a kind of public health ethics, but also rights point of view, is this a complete shift in the approach that would happen at that point?
From my perspective, I don't see it so much as a shift, rather than going further down the spectrum of putting the burden on the individual, right? So even if we think about protecting the lack of PPE, seeing healthcare workers as heroes, where there is very little infrastructure to actually support them in their work, the sort of discriminations built into the systems, and so on and so forth. I think this is more than, it is not just flipping, it's just going from using the idea of giving certain people individual freedom in order to then burden others in terms of increasing their own vulnerabilities and responsibilizing them for not just for their own health, really, because we used to talk about solidarity. Now we're talking about there's increased sort of terminology around warfare, for example, which is very problematic, around securitization, where and that's really quite problematic, into going from this collective perspective of vulnerability into sort of pathologizing vulnerability into individuals, and therefore burdening them and responsibilizing them for not just their own health, but of people around them as well.
So if I might jump in there with a slightly differing opinion. Under the rule of law, we are, of course, assuming that the individual freedom is a given, and where it has been limited due to measures being taken in order to fight the coronavirus pandemic, we are in general obliged to give back that freedom as soon as possible. And we're trying to do that with a variety of measurements in the moment, and none of them can really claim that we are certain whether they will work and which risks they pose. So we are taking risks at the moment while we're opening up the schools again, while we're opening up the kindergarten, and everywhere we look, there are risks being taken. And I think this is something that is also true with regard to immunity certification. The idea of limiting personal freedom with regard to safeguarding against the spread of the virus is based on the assumption that all of us are potentially dangerous and potentially threatened by the virus. And when we can assume with a specific degree of certainty, and that's problematic, I know, that someone is immune, i.e. non-infectious, then that assumption no longer holds true. So we are in general under the obligation to lift the restrictions we imposed on them. And because just the basic legitimacy of the measure is no longer there. The idea being that, oh, well, everyone is with certain statistical probability a risk or being or is threatened.
So can I just pick up from there? I mean, if we accept the premise that there is in a sense a formal obligation to lift restrictions on people's liberties as and when we possibly can, we understand that there are potential implications in terms of equalities and discriminations that might be associated with that. This takes us onto the question of possible mitigations, and I think we've talked about a number of times. I think Ago we must, it's the third of your points. Can we do this in a way that is mitigating? We have a question in the Q&A column which asks, for example, might providing a universal basic income provide some measure of mitigation? I think it's it may be one part of that. I suspect it would be a long way short of complete mitigation. But are there other ways in which we can think of this if we accept the premise that we must move towards lifting of restrictions on people whenever we possibly can?
Could I come in?
Finger is waving.
Yeah. Well, theoretically, I think we could, but I suppose when I started thinking about this, my presentation, I was thinking about the possibilities of those mitigations and became very, very pessimistic rather than optimistic that they were possible, precisely because of the whole tone of government actions over all sorts of issues, such as, you know, benefits and funding of the NHS and yesterday's immigration bill, and all these things came together to suggest to me that there isn't the will to mitigate in the way that I would want to mitigate, and that if there is this, I understand, I'm not naive, I understand the importance of the economy, capital E, but I also understand the dangers of the economy even when it's functioning at its very best. And it feels as if, and I had a section that I had to take out where I followed that line of all the policies that have shifted responsibility from the government onto individuals. And as you, Hugh, pointed out at the beginning, if this issue became marketized or monetized in any way, the government could make a choice to barely be involved in something that they had planted as an idea rooted in public health goals, but actually something that is picked up and run with in a very different way. So I'm afraid I became more and more pessimistic rather than optimistic when thinking about this.
Can I, you can see the other question, you might want to pick up on anything else that's there, but there's a point that I wanted to just develop a little bit more, which is about, it's very easy to look at antibody testing and immunity and supposed immunity, which might not last for long, and it doesn't mean that people are necessarily unable to transmit the disease by other means. But there is also this other element, which is that there may be other ways of identifying levels of risk, whether it is some studies that are starting to look at possible genomic factors of whether people are more or less likely to contract COVID, and also by membership of certain groups who may be at higher or lower risk. And once you play that in as well, it is actually rather more complex again than simply saying, do you or do you not have antibodies that have shown that you've had previous exposure? I mean, that I think puts another level onto this. I just kind of leave that as an observation for you to respond to.
I mean, I think yes, I'd worry. Like Bobbie, I think I'm the in-house pessimist here as well. I think I'd be equally worried about that because of the ways I've seen the discussion go from you know, the early evidence we've had around Black and minority ethnic groups being more vulnerable to COVID, and how quickly the language has shifted into responsibilizing groups, right? We're talking about nutritional factors, we're talking about genetics, we're talking about lack of understanding when it comes to language. Should we start translating? Of course we should start translating documents, but that's not going to take care of racism. That's not going to take care of systematic inequalities, right? And so I think I'd worry even more to think that we would want to categorize people with according to vulnerabilities, because that sort of opens the doors to even more sort of potentially blanket discrimination and stigmatization of groups, even whether you have the immune status or not, right? So
yeah, I agree. We've been so cautious about this, and quite rightly so, in relation to genetic findings in relation to other health issues. But I think I would also say that if we felt we were working from a solidaristic, welfare-focused perspective in the first instance, then we might be looking to mitigate some of these issues. But I feel that the whole tenor of the discussion that will develop, if it develops more at a political level, will be so linked to the economic factors that actually there will be little space to think about the things that really do continue to put people at risk. For example, bad practices in the workplace, when people feel that they no longer have to protect their workers because they are in some sense certificated.
So we only have a minute or two left, and Steffen, I wonder whether, I mean, with your optimism about potential for mitigation, I mean, one can see how one might do that within the kind of structures of a legally well-defined approach. But if these are playing out in many different ways, can you reach that far into you know, how? Let's use the word certification quite broad. Yeah. Can those mitigations reach far enough to protect people who are in those either workplace or social or environments where they don't have good access to health services or other things anyway?
Well, hopefully we can. I think it's also part of the problem how we fund it. So one of the proposals we have, it has to be publicly funded. In general, I think it would be important to note that actually, I guess same in the UK as it is here, we're already being swamped with advertisements regarding the private testing. So you're back to a normal life with private antibody testing. And that's something that the market is providing at the moment. And I think what would be preferable to that is having a state-controlled possibility that the tests as such are much more reliable, that the conditions under which they are implemented are much more reliable. And if we don't do that, if we refrain from implementing any of such measurements, then we're actually strengthening the private and much more problematic side of the institute. So I'm guessing what I'm trying to say is, I think, why not think about how we can actually counteract these problematic instances, how we can work against we can safeguard against the risk that I'm in agreement with. So I do see the problems. I think also do see that there are some cultural differences.
Thank you. So I have to wind this up, and my brief that I've been given by colleagues is to say I've now got to do a summary. I refuse to do this. I will just say this, is simply to say that I think that whichever line one might wish to take, I think it is quite clear that government cannot sidestep this, authorities cannot sidestep this and just let it ride, because with increased availability of private testing and increased potential for people to try to identify and create their own spaces where they might allow or bar people from entry one way or another, this does need carefully considered policy, and it is not something that can simply be allowed to drift. I think that's quite clear, and it's quite urgent. Listen, I just then want to thank you all. I apologise to those who put questions if we haven't quite addressed the points that you've raised. We will try and gather them up and refer to them in the brief report of this that we will put online. The whole thing has been recorded and will be available online within the next day or two. Please do come again when we have the next webinar. We don't know quite what it is, but for the time being, many thanks to Bobbie, Ago, Steffen for joining us in this. This is our intention in publishing our briefing note and our discussion paper was to stimulate, to bring on a much wider public engagement, and the point about involving public in these kind of discussions is so critical. So if we've helped to promote that discussion, I think that's as much as we can have done for the moment. And thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again
Close
soon.
down now and see you again soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.